Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you, all the panelists. And thank you for the first roundtable. This is Rodrigo Montedioca. For those of you who just connected, I'm a researcher here at the Baker Institute at Rice University, and it's my honor to be the moderator of the second panel that aims to understand how the Mexican electorate behaves itself. And for that, we have two experts in electoral dynamics. I'm going to ask for them to turn on their cameras. First of all is Dr. Giselle de la Cruz. She is a professor and she's a researcher at the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez. We also have Dr. Reinaldo Ortega, who is a professor and researches at El Colegio de Mexico. We also have Dr. Wilbert Sonleitner, who is professor and researcher also at Colegio de Mexico. And finally, we have Jose Fredman Mendoza, who is a professor at the University of Monterrey. Welcome, Jose. And we are a little bit over. We're a little bit behind, actually. So I would like to start with the first question. Reinaldo, are you there?
Okay.
Okay. We'll start then with Giselle, with you. We'll go with you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, the camera turned itself off. I need for somebody to turn on my camera. The host turned it off. Can we get the technicians, please, if you can help us turn on Dr. Ortega's camera?
Gracias.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. So we'll start with you then, Reinaldo. Reinaldo wrote an essay very interesting about the changes in the Mexican party system in the last 20 years, 2 decades. I think this can give us a certain context for this roundtable. So the first question that I have for you, Reinaldo, is if you can give us a diagnosis in how does the Mexican party system arrive in general, and how do the different political parties arrive? Not all 61 political parties that Professor Merino was talking about, but how does Morena, PRI, PAN, Movimiento Ciudadano, how do those systems, parties arrive at the election? Okay, thank you. To try to answer this question, first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being part of this project. This roundtable has been very interesting. I'm thrilled to get to know the work my colleagues are doing, and no doubt this roundtable will throw some light on what will happen on June the 6th. So in order to give you some context for the audience, in this essay that I was asked to write, what I really do is I write about the evolution of the historical development and some of the main patterns in the national environment of these political parties. And I analyze, well, starting in 2000 until 2018, basically what presidential elections have done. And in terms of classification, I see like 3 different times, historical times, 2000, 2012, and 2018. And one election, 2006, that it was a conversion, so to speak. And what I mean by this is when there was a change in the electoral landscape, in the identities, or in the elections, or the preference to vote for certain parties. So by 2018, we saw, no doubt, was a very critical element that's very, very important, in which you see a new political party, Morena, that was part of the midterm elections, but had like 8-9%. With their coalition and their history and their candidate achieve over 50%. And that is totally out of usual. That's not normal. If we analyze what happened, and this is important to mention, if we analyze, and like it was said before, the performance of these parties in the legislative arena, something that you see is this diversity is kept, these diverse political parties. I would say basically we have three big actors in this. At this time, it would be Morena, the coalition between PRI-PAN and PRD, and I'm gonna and then they would come like in the second place, and I think that's very important. And you see this realignment, this crucial realignment in 2018. And another one of the aspects that I review in my text in more detail is the importance of public financing, because even before 2018, the correlation, the link between public financing and electoral results in the three presidential elections that came before 2018, it was 0.7. So it's very high. It's very high. So the resources and the institutional context explain in good measure the results of the elections. They do not explain the remaining 30%, but they explain a lot. However, in 2018, we see a very atypical election, because here one of the parties with the least resources, Morena, with their coalition, they yeah, and as we know historically, they won the elections, but the correlation maintains, it's still 0.3, 0.4. So I think the institutions and the resources that those institutions provide are fundamental in order to understand the electoral results, and I think they will be fundamental in these elections as well. And according to the surveys that we have, well, different methodologies change, but we estimate about 40% of the electorate will vote for Morena, which is the governing party, and the other 40% will be divided between PRI and PAN. And that's the new coalition. And we will have in the third place Movimiento Ciudadano with 5 to 10%, and the Partido del Trabajo perhaps a little bit. But basically, it would be like my first reaction. Now, is it true? And it is true, in fact, that there was a big change in 2018. But the institutions and the resources that exist and that are available to the different parties, I think that they will sort of set things in the same perspective, and then long-term outcome if you look at those components.
Thank you, Reynaldo. Giselle de la Cruz wrote a very good article. You're going to see when it's published, and also you will see the publication in English in the white papers that will be published by the Baker Institute on party strategies and some points on the uh, personalist role of the president. But Giselle, I would like to ask you, what do you think about this decision of the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD to establish this atypical alliance? What do you think? Thank you, Rodrigo. First, I don't know if it would be possible for me to share some charts that will make it very clear. This is a very graphical, very visual. I worked on some charts that would be more enlightening. I think if you allow me to show these graphs.
Okay,
Yes,
perfect.
we'll ask for that now. And okay, this idea emerged really, I would say, this analytical catharsis of being able to see the whole context and seeing that there was a capacity to generate an agenda, to see a much more reactive attitude on the party, on the part of the parties. It's not that we are deciding about party projects or ideological projects only. So I think this issue of the alliance of the PRI and the PAN, I think this a strategic matter. It goes beyond ideologies or political traditions of the parties. In fact, in this chapter, I say that if we looked at this Mexican process, this two dimensions of opposition participation, we can say that this is seen from the axis of the opposition. So what's at risk at this point is the existence of actors of real events. We have on one part a president who is establishing the agenda or determining the agenda, and then we have the veto environment. We see opposition environment that's very is much debilitated. So the alliance, the premise of the alliance is completely strategic when faced with the challenge of the continuation of a majority like this one in Congress. So uh, also we see them facing the challenge of an agenda that's coming from Los Pinos, where they need to be reactive and they're facing a discourse that has undermined the image of traditional parties. And we have this anti-party sentiments. So in general terms, this is what I deal with in this chapter with data, with which was very interesting because it was the whole strategy of the discourse, the reiteration of the message of corruption and how it has undermined the image of the parties. So basically, those were the basic ideas that I took into account to produce this document. And as I said, maybe I can illustrate those points that I'm making in a graphic fashion because the spaces of this competition are very well defined. They're very clear. And as I said again, we're talking more about a strategic alliance, and that I think is more reactive. Yeah, they're letting me know that now that in your second intervention you'll be able to show these graphs. I remind the audience to please ask questions, whether in English or in Spanish, using the Q&A icon in the Zoom app. And after the questions and the discussion of the panelists, you will be able to answer. I'm moving on to Jose now. Jose wrote an article, what he called low intensity citizenship, or that's the way it's called in the literature. I would like to start with that, Jose, if you could define this concept for the public who's maybe not so familiar with it. What's for you low intensity citizenship? How does the literature explain it?
Of course, Rodrigo. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. For me, this is such a pleasure to be here with you, spending some time with these great teachers. Most of you I read while I was still studying my doctorate, so it wasn't that long ago. So it's an incredible honor to be here sharing this roundtable with you. And for those of us that are doing this kind of research, it's a real honor. So as you mentioned, Rodrigo, the work that I did was about the low intensity citizenship. There is a concept that comes from Guillermo O'Donnell, where he develops a very realistic formula of the role that citizenship plays as part of democracy. Because here in this roundtables, we're talking about democracy, the future of democracy, the political parties, but the citizens are the basis of the political parties at the end of the day. So what's happening with them? And we cannot think that every citizen is the same, or there are many inequities, political, economic, social, cultural, that stop or restrict exercising your rights. So you need to look at it in very practical terms, and you need to rescue this concept of citizenship that talks about rights and obligations to exercise this right. But this falls on the backs of all those peoples that are, for instance, outside the main cities, the people who live in those brown areas, red areas, where you have to look at relationship with poverty, discrimination, inequality. They don't have the resources, and that stops them from really being able to exercise and participate in the political system. So this low intensity citizenship, as Guillermo O'Donnell describes, and based on that is that I prepare my text. Thank you so much, Jose. That is a very interesting point that we want to go back to later on. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Willie Sonnleitner, who prepared a very interesting essay on how does the Deep Mexico vote. It's a very, very interesting text. He also shows us maps and geographies and numbers that really show you how these different sectors of society behave in terms of elections. The first thing that I would like to ask you, Doctor, is how the different cleavages, I'm talking about urban, rural vote, indigenous vote, the south, the north, the center of the country, how they vote, how these cleavages will affect these coming elections, the ones that we're having in 9 days. Well, very good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. As we see, to begin with, before we talk about cleavages, let's talk about two things. The electoral process, the last electoral process in the US, demonstrated clearly the importance of geography and this spatial dimension of votes. In Mexico, we don't really, we're not in the habit of looking at territorial dimensions beyond big regional differences. They really don't have a territorial component attached to them. Let's say in Mexico, there are very few people that look at electoral geography. And the second problem that we have is we're very used to reading and interpreting data and surveys, but it's really difficult for us to read and interpret maps correctly. So like Giselle mentioned, it would be good to look at maps, but at any rate, we don't have the time to do it right now. And I know there are some publications that you can take a look at, and especially look at the color maps, because that you can find those online. And I say this because in the US, the territorial dimension was very important, clearly important. And that was during the presidential election. The elections that we're having now, and these are not presidential elections, these are 2,000 different elections. So the territorial component is going to be fundamental for us to understand how things are going to be reconfigured, how the map is going to be reconfigured at all three levels, all three levels, the four, 5 levels of government right now. So let's look very quickly. I'm going to give you some keys so that you can read the complexity of these elections and to read the territorial message. And we have to remember that there are many different Mexicos. You remember that Donald Trump talked about many Mexicos to talk about Latin America, I think? But here we're talking about Mexico, and Mexico is a very complex country. It's a country that has 2 million square kilometers and 126 million in population, and it's as complex as continental Europe and the 12 countries that you have in continental Europe. So quickly, I'm going to tell you about 5 of these cleavages that we have to take into account. The first one is urban versus rural. And that's clearly, and the surveys really capture this information very clearly. We all know that you vote very differently in the rural areas versus the cities. We just know that. And we know that politically, this things work. In cities, PAN is normally successful. In the countryside, in rural areas, PRI. And then, in some other areas, you have to look at how the different parties behave. Now, behind that urban-rural cleavage, that really is the result of 3 different complex processes, development processes. You have other cleavages behind those. One that's very clear and is very relevant for this session is the north-south cleavage. What the geographies call the opposition between Mesoamerica and starting in the 60s and going to the 80s, there was a fundamental change in the development model that makes Mexico look up to the US more and more so every day. And the dynamics in the north are totally different because if you have the maquilas, you have the factories, but there's a Mesoamerica that is very different, that is also part of the US. And it goes beyond the borders. So the cleavage here is quite evident. It used to benefit PAN in the north, and PRI was a lot more supported in Mesoamerica. The third cleavage that is less understood and that we have to really analyze, then you have the Catholic, secular, Protestant cleavage. That is historical, that is structural, that comes from the colonies. The country was developed in a good part based on religion. And, Catholicism is fundamental for that. What's interesting when you look at this map, when you look at Catholics, this is a very different map, very different from urban, rural, or north, south, because the dynamic here is center and periphery. There is a very, very Catholic center. The Bajío is very Catholic. And then as you get away from the Bajío, whether you go to the borders, north or southern borders, then there's an erosion of Catholicism as you go north or south. And that's another cleavage that's very interesting. There's a fourth one that maybe you're not going to recognize, but it's very, very important for those of us that look at human geography and electoral geography, is the cleavage, anthropological cleavage, the one that has to do with family structure. I'm going to give you here something that is very surprising, but for instance, when you do the census in Mexico, you have indicators such as wedding rates, divorce rates, separation rates, and those rates, for reasons that are very complex to analyze here, they do explain, even in electoral terms, a lot of the behavior. Not because a person who's divorced is different from somebody who's married, but because there are territories in which weddings or married people are concentrated, and there are some territories in which there are a lot of divorced people, and those territories themselves have different features, different characteristics that then translate into different electoral maps. The fifth cleavage is the linguistic cleavage, and I'm going to leave that to the second round, because that is the cleavage that goes between the pre-Hispanic Mexico, Amero-Indian Mexico, the deep Mexico, as Guillermo called it, Guillermo Bataglia. And in order to sort of break with the stereotypes here, this cleavage that should be very clearly marked here, it really is a lot more heterogeneous than you can think. Not only that, but historically, really, obviously, is not a pre-Hispanic cleavage. It's a cleavage that has been changing throughout time, and it's really a cleavage that was created or came up in the post-revolution in the 30s, last century. So I'm going to leave that explanation for the second part because I do not want to abuse my time here. I think that's perfect, and we'll go back to that. We'll go back to that during the second intervention. So I'm going to go back to you, Reynaldo, and I would like to take advantage of the fact that you're here and you're an expert in political parties, and we've heard a lot during this forum and in the in press about Morena, whether it's a party, whether it's a movement, or what it is. So I would like to know your opinion. Is Morena a democratic party, or is it not a democratic party? What is your opinion in that regard? Well, let's see. I would quote Michels here. All parties have oligarchic trends, all of them. And that is because of the structure of the parties themselves. And here, I would say what I think is very interesting in terms of the evolution of Morena, first of all, as a movement, and a movement surrounding a candidate that now he is the president of the Republic. But it starts with the discourse and positioning, saying we are the left, and they were able to convince the electorate that in 2018 they represented the left. That part I think is very interesting. Now, versus what the candidacy was about, and comparing it to past elections. If you look at the candidacy of Manuel's candidacy in 2006, 2012, without any doubts, the coalition that surrounds Andrés Manuel. Those of us that know history, we know Morena is one of the actors, but it's by no means the only one. But it's a coalition that is searching for a strategy, what you call a catch-all party. That's what the literature says. Something that will catch everybody. Is this catch-all that will include businesses, intellectuals, students, and that part, I think, is not well understood yet in terms of the evolution of the party or that movement. So what we saw in 2018 was not just simply a realignment to the left, so to speak. Yes, in terms of the party structure, that's what they said, that's what they had, and the candidates that were running at the time, that's what they said. But in terms of parties, this that was the origin of Morena, starting, as a left party. It changed during those years. And it changed very quickly into something that looks a lot more similar to what we had in the regime prior to that one. So it's a party that tries to gather everybody, different political forces, different social groups that are very different and that have nothing in common. So using a lot of pragmatism, there isn't really a discourse that's a very ideological discourse. It's a discourse that tries to retake successful topics, things that were successful during a campaign, the need for parties and the elites to listen to the people, etc., things like that. So that is important. It is true that there has to be a transformation, but while it is a party that is a very young party, this legitimacy, this charismatic aspects to it, it has been transforming, and it's really hard for it. Same thing that we see now. At the end of the day, the new Secretary General of Morena, you see who it is. So every party, and especially those parties that appear surrounding a very important figure, that surround the charismatic leader that goes beyond the institutions. When that is the structure, things are really hard. And it happened to PRD at the time, yeah, also. So Cárdenas is the one that would decide everything that was going to happen, everything that was going to happen with all the PRD government entities. So that led to a certain failure in terms of their efficacy as a government. And there was a learning curve that was really important. And in terms of the importance and the discipline and the ability to come with a structure that you can discipline and make it work. So this goes back to what I said in the beginning about Mijes. And Mijes, he studied the national democracy in Germany, and the hypothesis is proven because the German social democracy, we see there already the same tendency to verticality, to oligarchy. So what can you do? And that is a different story altogether. How do you control those impulses? You can have different institutional mechanisms, and they exist. They're always there. And in this case, in this particular party's case, it's very clear that they're there.
Thank you very much, Reinaldo. And Reinaldo, your last comment leads me to the following question to Giselle. Your text talks about the personal leadership or the personalistic leadership of Obrador, and whether it's all just propaganda. How does he assume that leadership in the party or the way he governs the country? My question, separate from you showing us the graphs that you wanted to share, how do you analyze this? How can we go beyond that personalistic, person-centered leadership of the president? A very good question, Rodrigo, but a very complex one because it's a trend that unfortunately it's a global trend. This personalization of politics, and this has to do with what we were you were saying about the cleavage. Uh, it's very important because when there was a crisis of the catch-all, they were saying that this catch-all, the idea that Reynaldo was talking about, it leaves out this cleavage structure that articulates the political parties. So what happens is that political parties stop development programmatic structures based on that cleavage structure to establish this catch-all strategy. So what happens in the meantime? Well, this cleavage system, and then a leader comes and exploits that or generates new cleavages, and we see the polarization, or based on those breaks cleavages, establishes that polarization and gains terrain. Parties stop using a long time. We see Torcali Montero when they say it's not a party crisis, it's not that the institution itself is in crisis. What's in crisis is that link of political representation. So I think that the problem we have, the complexity we face with this type of leadership based on charisma and emotion, a representation of those sectors, those breaks or cleavages that have become the political strategy. So this implies, I think, a change of paradigm. And as far as political competition for political parties, this is the challenge. Which new strategies, which new cleavages, which new political strategies of the parties articulate a new competition axis based on social division lines and social realities? I think that the day the political parties can retake this representative idea, that might help us. And it's pretty much a state of need. There's a need for companies to determine their strategies when we see these schemes. Very interesting, Giselle. I don't know, Rodrigo. You tell me. I think what Reynaldo was saying was very interesting, and we can see the graphs in the chapter. It is, in fact, what Reynaldo is saying, this niches that is an indicator that allows us to not only see the spaces of competence, but also there's more of an ideological vocation, there's more than niche. And niches, Morena's niche is smaller. The PRD niche is much smaller. We'll see that Morena's niche, and I agree completely with what Reynaldo says, is another catch-all, but as a party. But the leader discourse is based really on this populist idea, exploiting these ideas. I represent you. You have not been represented. And another thing that caught my eye is even in the media, the overexploitation of one issue. It's a shortcut to the electorate because the electorate votes based on the information available, and sometimes the electorate, certain profile of the electorate, will be vote based on what's continuously reiterated to them, even if it's not necessarily real. So if I'm being told all the time that the others are corrupt, I ask the people why they vote for Morena. The first argument you hear from any Morena voter is that they are tired of corruption. So it's been an effective communication strategy based on reiterating the message. You see that in the analysis of the discourse. Right in the middle of the pandemic, the pandemic was not the main subject of the discourse. So it's not the crisis and not poor people. The main focus, issue that's repeated in the discourse and in the speeches is corruption. Okay, if you want, we can you can share your screen and we can discuss it.
Gracias, Giselle. José, voy contigo.
So, Jose, I'll go back to you first. We see the challenge faced by political parties to combat this personality cult that's appearing both nationally and internationally. How is the citizenry acting uh, around the election? How does this strategy work and what environments does it work? So what's the role of the citizens, or what can we expect from them? Yes, Rodrigo, thank you. It's a good question. What is the role of the citizenry now? I dare say, because I've seen this at other times, that the academics were always talking about the counterweight in Congress, but people usually don't know. They don't even know what's their electoral district. They don't know who their federal representative is, and they don't have any idea about different proposals or what the working plan is of the federal representative or the candidates to that position. So I think there is an educational deficit, as Jose Waldenberg was saying, that's still present in society. So I insist that in the periphery, I mean, in the urban areas, we see that decay. But in the periphery, in the surrounding areas, that's where we see this uh, low citizenship. Let's look at Nuevo León, Garcia, Nuevo León, Ciega de Flores, all the municipalities around the metropolitan area of Monterrey. The uh, voter lists have grown exponentially. They're all of them are going to vote. So what are the political parties doing to fulfill their role as political educators too? That's what they're there for too. So what are they telling people? So, and how are people receiving that information? I think they're not receiving any type of information. They're not receiving any message. And I agree with Dr. Merino when he started his presentation. Uh, these elections are local. The coalition PAN, PRI, PRB. There are states like Nuevo León where it's a no-go. There's a useful vote. So who could that vote in Nuevo León, that useful vote, go to? So the Movimiento Ciudadano, how useful is it for Nuevo León? Because we are coming out of 6 years of independent. So we know what the risks are of voting for just, those smoke screens, that red herrings that they tell you about, and people consume that, people swallow that. So the behavior of this citizenry that seems to be low intensity, that lives normally in the periphery, indigenous peoples, single moms, people, multiple issues. And there is a stereotype, of course, but it's true that this is something that happens in this periphery, and the presence of the state, or the absence of the state, or the presence of the state of government in a way that they shouldn't be present. So there's no equality. There's not the same conditions. And this, the basis of democracy and intrinsic quality. So a educated perception, I think that's what's lacking in the Mexican citizenry. We don't know what a local congressman does, what a federal congressman does. We don't know about who they are. I have asked that in political science classes. So what can we expect from the general population who is not present in this type of spaces? That's the big issue. Why are they there? Why not? What information are they receiving? How are they going to vote on June the 6th? Very interesting, Jose. So, Willie, how about you? You were going to explain about this last cleavage, and I would like to ask a question about a matter that Jose mentioned, the electoral fidelity or loyalty. So, what's the role of the parties? Is this reflected or not in the way people vote in the areas you analyzed? I don't know if you, after you explain that fifth cleavage, the linguistic one, if you can expand on that. Well, we will conclude on that very polemic issue. Everybody has something to say about it. But to summarize the study of voting in indigenous communities, what we have to underline is that there's no indigenous vote. It does not exist. And I'm saying this 3 times because every time I'm in a 45-minute conference and I see that 20 times. At the end, somebody finally asks me, what's the indigenous vote? Who do indigenous people vote for? And of the 4 cleavages I presented before, in contrast with those, this one does not have electoral implications, this 5th one. And it has to do with the stories of the conception of the indigenous peoples and what's the national imagery. There's no indigenous group. There's 65 populations, 65 peoples with very different characteristics. Only 16 of them have over 100,000 members. 22 of them have less than 1,000 people. So we're talking on occasional communities, sometimes towns, sometimes municipalities, sometimes regions, and some occasions, for example, Yucatan, the Mayans, of course, they are over 1 million, and they go, of course, beyond state borders. They have a big demographic weight, but also they are within contexts that have a strong weight from the other cleavages, but they go across cleavages. To give you a clear example, in the Altos of Chiapas, that's in a completely different context than the Tarahumara sierras or the Otomi region or the Huasteca or the Yucatecan Mayans. The Yucatecan Mayans, it's not because they are Mayans, but because they reside in Yucatan, so obviously they vote more for the PAN, whereas in the Tarahumara Sierras, they vote more for PRI, and the Altos of Chiapas, they vote for any party. At one point, they voted for the Green Party, but now they vote more for leaders because the system is completely fragmented. So what they do have in common, indigenous communities, is that they were the subject of public policies that were very uh, voluntary and that were very strong, that were part of the strategy of Lázaro Cárdenas to build the state post-revolution. And that gave the PRI a very strong advantage for many years. But really, the myth of the indigenous vote comes to a large extent from the legacy of that construction. It has to do with the agricultural reform, uh, and not only the indigenous people, but also the mixed blood, the peasants. They were they preferred the children of the regime, and there were electoral policies related to that. And there's this indigenous trend that was able to capture some of the votes, but that was fragmented to the extent that the post-revolution pact fragmented. And after 2006, 2009, that comparative advantage stopped being operational because they were there was an alternation at the presidential level. There was changes at the government, state government level and locally, and that diversified, that changed that potential advantage that comparative votes could have related to social issues. And to give you an example, the PAN, which is a party of maybe the middle class, higher educational level, a completely different profile in contrast with indigenous communities. So the PAN was able to grow enormously between 2006 and 2010 in many indigenous regions where they implemented social programs from the executive level, even with indigenous representatives, etc., with a whole strategy oriented towards those areas. And, I'll summarize and then we'll talk about social programs and clientism and social programs. In contrast with what happens in the US, where since 1980, 80% of African Americans vote for the Democratic Party. And since in 94, 94% of African Americans voted for Obama later. So in Mexico, we don't have that type of phenomenon. But what I want to emphasize, and in my article, I have a control group that allows to distinguish between indigenous peasants and mixed blood peasants, and that in contrast with the urban behavior, developed areas with a residual area. And we see that the linguistic cleavage cannot explain things. And that happens when we do multivariate models. We include all the demographic variants that capture all the cleavages. The indigenous language does not have an explaining capacity, or it does, but 0 point something. But I mean, it's statistically significant, but it's not substantive, it's not relevant. In contrast, amongst the speakers of native languages, there is, the Tarahumara region has a bias. Other regions have a bias, but it's pretty artificial one. When we go into the regions, we see an impressive internal diversity. Now, and I will conclude with this about Morena. The interesting thing about Morena is that they went from 8% in 2015 to 39% in the legislative elections of 2018 and to 54.8% in the presidential elections with the coalition. So the geography of these three phenomena, Morena in 2015, Morena as a party in the legislative elections in 2018, and the coalition of Manuel Lopez Obrador in the presidential election, they have demographic profiles that are completely different. In 2018, they did not have much success in the indigenous regions, but current polls are showing that the social demographic profile is changing, and it probably has something to do with some social programs. So, but to give you an example, the age structure has changed a lot, and the young ones, the old ones, have completely changed their electoral profile. And if that happens at the age level, it's very clear that it's going to happen with social issues in these segments. So I think there's going to be a new geography is going to emerge from this election, a number of new geographies. Thank you very much.
Quickly, one follow-up question is a question from the audience. Have you been able to identify in these cleavages that you reviewed, is there any gender issue that you think you have, how people vote according to gender that is delicate? I don't think there is a difference. What many studies show in many countries in the world is that gender differences are due to the introduction of women's vote. That's when the difference shows, and then as time goes by, then the differences sort of get lower, they decrease. There are complex differences that have to do with gender, but since we're talking about half the country, which is present in all the different Mexicos that we've been talking about, So obviously, the rural versus urban, Catholic versus Protestant or secular, rich versus poor, all those things seem to be more important or way more compared to the gender variable in the different contexts. Because women, fortunately, they live everywhere. They live in all the different areas of the country. So fortunately, they share all the spaces with men. So that makes them present in all the different Mexicos. Thank you, Will. There are very few municipalities where the rates women versus men are maybe out of proportion. They may have to do with migration, but it's 1, 2, 3 different cities, but nothing significant. Okay. We are sort of behind again. So, Giselle,
No sé si la ven
I
ahí.
don't know if you can see. Here it is. Can you see it? Yes. Yes, we see it. Yeah, here's your presentation. I'm going to go very fast. This is basically what I mentioned, how the transformation of the party system, the concentration of power. This is the graphic expression. This is the opposition versus participation. But I'm going to go to the tables. I don't want to use too much time. The frequency of words in López Obrador's discourse. Here we see the words. We're talking 2018 to 2020, first and second speech after 1 year of government, 2 years of government. This is the review to see the frequency of the use of terms. We see corruption, health, business, security, employment, economy, crisis, corruptions. So investment is not even in the discourse. What are the consequences? Confidence in the political parties, which is what I wanted to talk about. This is post 2018, 2019, the public opinion survey and LA Pop. And we see corruption of public officers. That is a generalized concern. So we see this, and we see that his discourse sort of matches the public perception of what the issue is. But however, this is what we see: level of confidence on the president, a lot of confidence on the president. This is on this public opinion poll. Another thing that I wanted to mention is to see how this idea of has gone down. This is what I was talking about. The continuous exposure in media and control of the public agenda generates inequity. And what I was talking about, how much you like the political parties, and we see that's very negative perception, zero confidence in political parties. That's why the question, that is the big challenge that the political parties have. How do you recover? How do you get back that confidence that you don't have anymore? You have this agenda, and you have this public perception that they're all corrupt. So how do you revert this perception that they're all corrupt? We're talking about the alliance and the spaces. Look at this is Pan and Pre. If you go right and left here, and you see the competition between Pan and Pre. So if you have an alliance here, you can say that the strategy, if we were to identify new strategies, they have to be strengthened right here. And this is the sector of the population that is between 5 and 10. How they share the same space, and that's why the reasonable thing to do would be for them to partner and to create these strategic alliances for the elections. And what we see here instead, we see totally differentiated. So I agree with Reynaldo 100% that it is not a left party at all, but that is how it's perceived. So you have this ideological placement, But when we do the image, it's very similar. Also, when we do PRI and Morena, we see how they are perfectly defined the spaces. So how do you solidify the results of this? You do it through polarization. We see the index of polarization. These are the indicators between the prior legislation and now we see the increase. This leads us to say that the spaces are very defined, very clearly defined, and the competition between both is very clear, and this indicator of polarization sort of strengthens the indicator. So it's very polarized. And that's what I was saying in terms of the superposition here. So the electoral strategies and how to do the discourse, they should focus on that segment, strengthening or focusing that we have this polarization data, and this is what I was talking about, this ideological niche. And as we said, this ideological spaces sort of solidify these indicators of superposition and polarization. Look at this. Look at the different niche. The box, the square, is the niche. So look at this. Look at Morena, for instance. Morena, the way a party behaves, ideological, whatever their representatives are, whether they may be to the right, they may be to the left, but this is very interesting when you look at the niche, because you compare the position of their representatives and the position of the electors. So this is some work that we did to see how we compare. So you look at the niche, you look by ideological positioning or positions on different niches, and so that allows us to build the niche. And as I mentioned before, even PRD could be in the same segment here in terms of competition, but we see that the PRD has a very, very small niche compared to Morena. So, Reynaldo, this sort of confirms your hypothesis that it is not a party that has so much ideology. Obviously, we know what happens with PRI and PAN. We see that PRI sort of shares a little piece of this. PRI and the alliance with PRI-PRD, maybe you can see a little piece, and that would be that would coincide with what we were talking about, the cleavages. And so you have, if this PRD pre-alliance, that may lead to winning some of that sector. So I don't want to use up any more time here. So you can read all the conclusions in my text on the essay. But basically, these are the conclusions. The conclusions are on the essay. But I wanted to show you the graphic information so that you can see the differences and the different spaces. Okay, we are, thank you so much, but we're really behind on time. I know that this is a very complex presentation because we have so many things to discuss. Thank you so much, Reynaldo, for your participation both in this event and for your written work. Jose, Freeman, also thank you so much for your participation. Willie, Giselle, thank you so much for your time and dedication and for having made this available. I'm trying to not share my screen anymore. Trying. Hold on, you're all, hold on. We still see your presentation. Your PowerPoint is still on the screen. Let me see how there we go. Ready. Yes, Reynaldo. The only thing, going back to what Giselle said and what Willie said, the only measure, and it's important because, I mean, that we're building now is the party identity of the people who belong to the Morena party. I think that's even stronger. And that's what predicts the future of the party and the party system itself, because that identity is occupying one space that, as the PRI lost people, many people left, many people that used to identify with it. So I think that is the only thing that I would add to what Willie said. And the other thing, Willie, I totally agree. There is a nationalization that the president sort of reinforces all the time. There's a nationalization of the elections, even though there is a huge diversity and how large the country is. That is very appropriate. Yeah, no, that is. let me clarify. The gender cleavage, I wanted to clarify so there is no misinterpretation. The gender cleavage exists and it is relevant, but it's linked to many other cleavages, in particular migration, for instance. So there are communities that sort of kick a lot of men out. And I'm not talking about 3 or 4 communities, I'm talking about a number of communities. But there are very complex interactions, just to correct the record so that I don't want to be lynched when I leave the meeting today. No, very, very important, Willie. Thank you. In terms of identity and Morena and identity, Reinaldo, there is an excellent text, Ricardo Rafael and Dr. Guadalupe Correa. They talk about that, and that is the roundtable or the panel that we're gonna hold right now. So I just have to thank you so much, Rice University, the Baker Institute, and I'm going to give the microphone to Dr. Correa. And we're going to invite the panelists, all the panelists for the third and last table to join us.